Hello, everyone, and welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of September 18th, and this is your Monday briefing.
We are back in a familiar place of wondering whether there will be a government shutdown, and for many of our viewers, will there be or won't there be a year-end tax bill?
And if you have questions about how a possible shutdown could affect you, you're not alone. To shed some light on the implications and possible policy outcomes, we bring you now a conversation between Chairman Dave Camp and Kevin Levingston.
Chairman Camp, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Kevin. Great to be here.
Hey, so one thing that seems to be top of mind for everyone outside of the Beltway is government funding. With that in mind, what are the chances of a continuing resolution, or CR as we call it, actually taking place? What are the factors that need to come together for that to actually happen?
Well, government funding runs out October 1st, as you know, and there's not a lot of time left to get something done. So it does look like there will need to be a CR, continuing resolution, in order to fund the government while they continue to work out funding levels. I think the main thing that needs to happen is Republicans need to come together or coalesce around some sort of approach to this. And over the weekend, there was some discussion between Freedom Caucus members and some of the more pragmatic members of the Main Street Partnership to try to reduce funding from 2023 levels and have some sort of border security provisions in that as well. It's already been shot down by some others in the conference. So they have to decide, are they going to be a player in the negotiations with the Senate, or wait for the Senate, which is really kind of moving in a more bipartisan way. They still have some of their hiccups in their process as well, because that would then mean the Senate would send something over to the House that the House would be under significant pressure to accept if in fact they pass a bipartisan continuing resolution in the Senate. So I think the path forward is really through some sort of border security, some sort of disaster funding. And I think that is the way that maybe you can find some level of government funding acceptable to the moderates in the House. And ultimately, I think at the end of the day, probably will depend on some Democrat votes in the House in order to get the measure passed.
Well, so hopefully something will pass. But what if there is a shutdown? How long do you think it'll last? And look into the crystal ball, and how do you see that impacting business if it does happen?
Yeah, that's something that's really hard to predict. And I think typically they do end at some point. I think if the Senate passes this bipartisan continuing resolution that I think might be the scenario, that puts enormous pressure on the House to do something. Of course, that then, if it passes with bipartisan votes in the House, I think that puts in jeopardy Speaker McCarthy. But at some point, they'll have to decide, are they going to have another speaker? And really, there is no alternative at this point to Speaker McCarthy. So to go through that exercise would be very chaotic for the Republicans and just
no doubt
clearly demonstrate the divisions they have in their conference.
Well, pivoting away from the budget for a moment, one thing that all of our clients are very focused on is what about those TCJA provisions, in particular, saving the jaw with the 163J interest expense limitation, R&D expensing, as well as bonus depreciation. Those seem to have bipartisan support, all the three of those provisions. At least they have from time to time. What are the chances of something happening before year end?
Well, they do. They have bipartisan support in the House and bipartisan support in the Senate. And of course, the question is what has to travel with those? And what we've heard is that's the child tax credit. And there really isn't an agreement at what level the child tax credit needs to be, because it's much more expensive than at least some of the tax provisions. I think there will have to be some sort of pay for part of this. So that's always a challenge to come up with, how do you pay for at least part of this? And I do think there's an opportunity for this to happen. I tend to be slightly more optimistic than maybe some others that these will happen, because members of Congress are facing an election year. I think they're going to be under some pressure to deliver on these business provisions. The business community has been lobbying very hard for these provisions, and they're necessary, and they do directly connect to investment, jobs, and making people's lives better, which is, I think, going to be a big issue as we move into the election year.
So on that, sticking with this theme, right, we saw recently the Senate passed unanimously, and the Senate Finance Committee, to be clear, passed unanimously the Taiwan Tax Agreement to provide double tax relief. Might that actually be a vehicle to deal with some of these provisions, these TCJA provisions?
Well, I think it might, because it had bipartisan support in the Senate and also in the House. So you have both bodies, really kind of uniting behind this provision and this legislation. So yes, that has a potential to become a vehicle. We'll see how soon this is taken up in the House. It's expected to be, sooner rather than later. But again, all of this gets a little bit complicated by the recent impeachment inquiry. We know Congress isn't always in a well-oiled machine, but this inquiry sort of throws sand in the gears of whatever machine is happening. So that really makes all of the issues we've discussed a lot more complicated and a more difficult environment, particularly if you're looking, as I mentioned, at legislation that will depend on some Democratic votes to move it over the finish line. And what concessions will they demand now that there's this impeachment inquiry out there?
Sure. Maybe less likely to work together. Even more hard to believe it could be any less than it already is today, but that will not help matters. So with that, maybe as we wrap up, what are some themes or other questions that you're getting from clients right now as you're talking to them around the country?
Well, the questions are a lot about the provisions we've discussed. How will the 3 TCJA extenders, if you will, when and how will they get across the finish line? And then obviously government funding is a real concern for many businesses as they really try to predict what the environment's going to look like going ahead. And so those are really top of mind. I think they'll be top of mind for several weeks. And, whether we have a government shutdown or not remains to be seen. There do seem to be some members of Congress that are kind of itching for a shutdown, having not been through it before. I don't know that really impacts the election in any way, but it's certainly not a good look if we were to move into a government shutdown.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
We hope you found that conversation helpful. We are, of course, staying on top of government funding talks and a lot more. Be sure to catch the latest Week in Review with Rohit Kumar, as well as an episode and an insight on the IRS's recent Section 174 notice. Remember to tune in later this week for another Week in Review.
Thank you as always for tuning in. Stay with Policy on Demand for the latest developments from Washington and around the world. Take care.